chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Then Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You're not going to believe this. It's something that maybe you hear from time to time. You wouldn't believe the fish that I caught. It was so big. Show me a picture. You're not going to believe this. In Maroon 5, a band that's really popular, they have a music video for a hit song, Sugar. And if you've seen this music video, you see that Adam Levine tells that they're going to go around LA and start crashing weddings, and they'll be playing their hit song at these weddings. And imagine you're one of the persons that had been invited to that wedding, but decided not to go. And then some people who you know who went to that wedding come back to you and say, "You won't believe this. Maroon 5 played at my wedding. Show me the pictures. I don't believe. Unless you show me the pictures, I will not believe. I will never believe." In our day and age, it's pretty easy to produce evidence. It's almost like there's always cameras rolling. There's always some way of verifying the facts of the stories. And so you can capture that moment. But in today's passage, we're talking about a story that was pre-cameras. The physical evidence would have been harder to believe. All Thomas had to go on was simply the testimony of the other disciples. And for him, that just wasn't enough. That just wasn't enough for him. It was a week earlier that they witnessed the Lord. They saw Jesus, and simply just not enough for him. Even though Thomas had seen many signs, even though Thomas had himself experienced the power of Christ, he simply wasn't going to believe. It was just too tall of a tale for him. Thomas's doubt in this passage is irrefutable for him, except for the evidence of a physical touch in the wounds of Jesus' hands and feet and side. So even if photography was available at the time, Thomas would have said, "That's not enough for me. I need to touch him. I need to stick my hands into his wounds." And that's what he means when he says, "Unless I see the nail marks." He says, "I will not believe," or in other words, "I will never believe," or "I will by no means believe." That is an absolute statement of, I'm not going to believe unless God shows me in this incredible sign. John Calvin puts it sort of strongly about Thomas in his commentary on this passage. I want to read it for you because we don't usually talk like this in church, but if John Calvin said it, then it's okay. He says, "The stupidity of Thomas was astonishing and monstrous. For he was not satisfied with merely beholding Christ, but wished to have his hands also as witnesses of Christ's resurrection." There it is. You know, and Thomas wasn't the only one, though. He was just the last one in a list of doubting. The disciples went to the tomb, and they didn't understand, nor did they really believe. They had to see for themselves what Mary had said was true. And even after that, they went away confused, the text says in John. And so, for those people out in the world who are they consider themselves scholars, I'm thinking of like a Bart Ehrman, if you know the name. They sort of say that the disciples were, you might say country bumpkins, but I like to say country pumpkins because they were born in a field and never really got anywhere. That's just so not true for the disciples in our text today. Especially Thomas. He's not just this sort of guy who would just believe anything you tell them just because he's a first century Jew. No, he was reasonable. He used logic. He used his mind. He thought hard. He was skeptical. So people who would say things like, in the first century, just the disciples really wanted to believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and that's why they seen him. Because they were hallucinating. He wasn't really raised from the dead. It's just, when you expect something so badly that you make it a reality, well, that is not actually the truth of this story. They didn't expect it. And in fact, Thomas emphatically said, I just simply won't believe it except for I experienced some irrefutable form of evidence. Like, they sound like 21st century scientists. Like, let's make this testable. And so if you want to think for 1 minute that, well, we can't really even trust the testimony of these first century believers because guess what? They lived in a different milieu than us. They were different than us. The way that they saw the facts was different than us. Well, not really. Not really. They doubted just as badly as we might doubt. They weren't just some people who just believed. He needed evidence. He felt like, yeah, Jesus is dead, and I know what happens to dead people. And as maybe Charles Dawkins has said, dead people don't rise from the dead. They stay dead. Well, how do you know that? Because we know that people don't rise from the dead. Well, if you discount all the instances in the Bible where people have risen from the dead, then nobody's risen from the dead. People have risen from the dead according to the witnesses. And so, yeah, we might doubt like Charles Dawkins and say, do people really rise from the dead? Well, Thomas thought, no, people don't rise from the dead. Look at this situation. And yet, here he has evidence. Christ himself presents evidence to him. And he believes. The crazy really thing about Thomas, though, and I mentioned it just a second ago, but that he had seen miracles done by Christ. He had been there when Jesus walked on water, when Jesus calmed the storm. He was there at Lazarus' resurrection. He had seen all the signs. And so it's kind of mind-boggling to think that would happen to him, that he would say, I don't believe at the end unless you provide me irrefutable evidence. But it's almost reminiscent of Israel's wanderings in the wilderness. They had seen God work in Egypt in mysterious, miraculous ways, the 10 plagues, and then the crossing of the Red Sea, and then all of the miracles and the manna in the wilderness. And yet they constantly said, did you bring us out here to die, Moses? They doubted, even after all that they had seen. And I think that this morning, that if any of us said that, hey, if I saw a miracle or something, I would never doubt. So if God just showed me a miracle, I'd be good. No, I think that we should see ourselves more like the children of Israel, more like Thomas, and saying that, you know what? Even if I saw a miracle, I think that somehow Satan may use something in my life to cause me to once again doubt and disbelieve. Hardships of life, whatever it may be. And you know who? One of the greatest theologians, I like C.S. Lewis a lot. If you haven't known, I quote from him a lot. But during a time of testing and trial for C.S. Lewis, he had the same struggle. He wrote in his book, A Grief Observed, and for him, it was after the death of his wife, Joy, that brought this about in his life. And in his memoir, he writes this, and I'm going to read it to you. During his struggle, he says, "Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you're happy, so happy, you have no sense of needing him. So happy, you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember to yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be received, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But when you go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, what do you find?" He says, "A door slammed in your face and the sound of bolting and double bolting inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might as well be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. And the seeming was so strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in our time of trouble?" He says, "Not that I think I am in danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is in coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but so this is what God is really like. Deceive yourselves no longer." Things in our life can come up that cause us to doubt in spite of all the great things that we've seen God do and experienced and witnessed in the scriptures. Things can come up. For him, it was the terminal battle with cancer for his wife. Maybe it could be any story that we've heard recently. A 4-year-old ran over by a truck. A 6-year-old who falls into a swift-moving river. A terminal battle with cancer for a loved one. An unfaithful spouse. Another amazing thing about this story is that Jesus does what is required for Thomas to believe. He doesn't have to do that. It's by grace that he does that for Thomas. Imagine that. By grace, he does that for Thomas. He is what John has said he is. He's the good shepherd that leaves the 99 to go for that one lost sheep. And that one lost sheep happened to be Thomas in this story. And he did what was necessary to do. And so I think it's also by grace that he gives us what we need to believe, the faith that we need to believe. It's a gift that he gives to us freely by his grace. And yet we may wander in our lives. I think we all will wander at times. He will leave the 99 and come to us and give us what we need to draw us back to him so that we may continue to believe. After C.S. Lewis had that experience, weeks later, he goes on to write this after he felt that God was gone and the door was locked and the lights were out. He says, "Something quite unexpected has happened. It came early in the morning for various reasons, not in themselves at all mysterious. My heart was lighter than it had been for many weeks. For one thing, I suppose I'm recovering from physically from a good deal of mere exhaustion. And I had a very tiring but healthy 12 hours work the day before, a sounder night's sleep. After 10 days of low-hung gray skies and motionless warm dampness, the sun was shining, and there was a light breeze. And suddenly, at the very moment when, so far, I mourned joy least, I remembered her best. Why has no one told me these things? How easily I might have misjudged another man in the same situation. I might have said, he's gotten over. He's forgotten his wife. When the truth was, he remembers her better because he's partly gotten over it. Such was the fact, and I believe I can make sense of it. You can't see anything properly while your eyes are blurred with tears. And so perhaps with God, I've gradually been coming to feel that the door is no longer shut and bolted. Was it my own frantic need that slammed the door in my face? The time when there's nothing at all in your soul except a cry for help might just be the time when God can't give it. You are like a drowning man who can't be helped because he clutches and grabs. Perhaps your own reiterated cries deafen you to the voice you had hoped to hear. And so God never gave up on C.S. Lewis in his time of doubting when he thought that God had abandoned him, that God was no longer with him. But God has done that for us too. When we doubt, he rescues us. In this passage here, Jesus has given us the greatest encouragement to stop doubting and believe. He says, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed. That's Christ's exhortation to us to stop demanding and simply believe. And then John writes this great tie-over about the purpose of his gospel. He says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these were written so that you may believe. That you is you and me. That we may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. That's probably the coolest thing in the whole world. That this was recorded so that we could be the ones in verse 29 that says, blessed are those who have not seen yet still believe. We can be the ones who say, I have not seen with my hands, I have not stuck my finger in his side, but I take the testimony that has been written down before me and I say, I believe it. I am not going to be the doubting Thomas here. I believe it. It's true. I believe it. One of the probably most encouraging thing that I've ever heard from one of my mentors is don't take your doubts too seriously. Don't take your doubts too seriously. You know why? And I have lots of doubts, and I experience doubt week by week, I'll say. But I don't take my doubts too seriously because I realize that doubts are based upon my experience and my intellect and my ability to reason out things. And I simply need to let that go and trust God. I simply need to lean into the scriptures and say, the testimony of these doubters who were convinced is enough for me. I'm going to lean into them so that I might have life in Jesus' name. You know, if God doesn't exist and this whole thing's a sham, it doesn't matter. You will not have regretted a life lived for Christ. You know why? Because when you die, if there's nothing afterward, there's nothing to regret. And I'm not saying that's a reason to believe, but let me just encourage you with that fact that you will never regret following Jesus. I'm going to close this time with an encouraging word from Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah writes, do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary. He increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who hope in the Lord will renew their strengths. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Let's pray.